Estamos en otra entrevista educativa. En esta ocasión tenemos la posibilidad de conversar con Charles Fadel. Charles es un profesor de Harvard y adicionalmente a eso ha fundado su propio instituto que es centrado en el rediseño curricular. Él está pensando en la educación del futuro y de hecho vino a Chile con motivo del Congreso del Futuro y queremos conversar con él respecto de los temas que tienen que ver con el futuro justamente de la educación. ¿Cómo estás, Charles?
I'm fine, thank you very much for having me here.
Well, maybe it's we can begin our conversation in terms of the diagnosis that you have about our society now. What do you think is the main tendencies that we are living?
Well, certainly everyone is witnessing the societal changes around us, from migration to inequities, from global warming to technological disruptions. We're seeing a lot happening to us as a humanity, and we're struggling trying to adapt and face those challenges. Technology is an amplifier of human abilities, and it can be an amplifier in a good direction and in a bad direction as well. And so we are being deluged with new technologies that are amplifying our abilities and the problems at the same time.
Do you think that you are really in a new period in our history as human beings?
I really believe so. We're on the cusp of profound changes like perhaps never before, between artificial intelligence on one side, shouldering our cognitive abilities, and gene editing on the other side, perhaps transforming what humans are about. We're on the verge of very, very profound changes. And I find our societies not particularly adapted to cope with that change, and that's why we see a reflex of fear in so many populations around the world. And that's a normal thing for humans to do. When there's too much change, you start closing down, which is the wrong reflex. It's just at the moment where you have to actually step forward optimistically and take control of the change. People want to be in control, and that's what we need to do. It's not a negative control, it's a positive control.
You think the change as an opportunity?
Completely. And so, of course, that implies adapting what we learn and how we learn to prepare us for this world. And this is valid not just for schools, but also for higher education and also for lifelong learning.
What is the main changes that are important for the educational system?
Well, the changes that are important are actually things we have known since Socrates and Confucius. What makes us successful in life is not just what we know, although even that needs to be modernized. It's also our skills, how we behave, how we use what we know. It's our character, which is how we behave and engage in the world. And it's also our so-called meta-learning abilities, which is our growth mindset and our metacognition, our ability to think about our own thinking and learn about our learning, to reflect and adapt to a world that's changing. This is what we've always needed as humans. This is what we all experience in our jobs all the time. And so why shouldn't education systems better prepare us for all of these facets of an education?
But in your diagnostic, if I understand well, you think that, for example, in the labor, in the works, we have a lot of changes.
Yeah.
And the system that we have now in the educational system for prepare the people for work is not good. It's not really adapted for the new challenges of the work.
Correct. When we went through the Industrial Revolution, we had an enormous change in education, and we invented mass education, mass schooling. And that served us well for 100 plus years. So we should not look at the present education systems in a negative way. It brought us as humanity where we are. But it's no longer sufficient. Times are changing, we have the digital revolution now, and it's forcing changes on a scale that we haven't seen before. For instance, out of these devices, I can find any information I want. So just knowing facts is no longer where the action is. Now it's a question of interpretation, finding meaning out of facts, and that's a higher order of skill.
In one of your books, you talk about this idea that we have new careers, new problems, new challenges that, and the most difficult point that we don't know what will be these new careers or the new problems.
But we never have. Education was always meant to prepare you for a world that you wouldn't know how it would be like later on. That has always been the case for education. However, we tried to design a system that was at the same time reasonably broad to prepare us. But what was reasonably broad in the past is no longer sufficiently broad. For instance, why so much time spent on the traditional disciplines and why no time left for entrepreneurship or wellness or social systems or robotics, all sorts of things that we need today. And in addition to that, why so little time spent on leveraging all that knowledge through the competencies we described, skills and character and meta-learning?
You think that this is one very important point, which is this point of the workforce and the labor world. But you have others that are important too. Yeah. For example, in terms of the citizenship, Absolutely. You think that also we have new challenges there?
Absolutely, absolutely. So nothing we're talking about here is only about work. We're talking about the entire Maslow pyramid of the human needs, right? From physical all the way to self-transcendence. And that's what makes us happy as humans, and that's what we all need to do. And work, employability, is only pertaining to 3 layers out of 7 or 8. So work is a necessary but not sufficient condition for human prosperity and happiness. So it is really about life and the requirements of life that we're talking about, including but not limited to work.
That is very important, because in some occasions we have this vision that all the things that the new world is linked with the imagined new changes in the labor world. Yeah. But you are talking about a more ample view.
It's a more ample view, but at the same time, I think education systems have gone too far in the past in the direction of neglecting the work aspect. Meaning, well, that's not our job. Well, I'm sorry. In the end, it's also your job. It's also our job as educators. We cannot just close our eyes and say, well, I just teach traditional mathematics and literature and so on, and good luck to you. The whole point of an education is to prepare you for everything life has to offer you, including work.
It's interesting in your books that you talk about this idea of you have a sort of false dichotomies.
Yeah.
And in some occasion it seems that you think that in the educational debate we have this idea to say one or the other. And in general, there Absolutely. Are things that you can combine.
Constantly. I mean, it's always an and conversation that should be, not an or conversation. It's not the psychosocial needs or the economic needs. It's both. They're linked.
It's the global and the local at the same time.
Exactly.
The mind and the body.
Mind and the body, thank you. So we have all these false dichotomies that we keep repeating, and it polarizes the conversation rather than make it an inclusive conversation.
One point that we can begin is about your model for approach to the education. You said that one part very important is the knowledge.
Yes.
In this knowledge, what do you think about that? Is a false dichotomy, for example, the traditional knowledge and the new knowledge?
Well, so traditional knowledge is no longer sufficient. I described earlier some new areas of knowledge that matter because, for example, the new jobs are not going to be created by large companies. They're going to be created by small and medium businesses. So entrepreneurship is at a premium. Why do we consider that understanding social systems is so uninteresting and so outside of the norm? Well, we are trying to understand ourselves and others, and so disciplines like psychology and sociology should also be learned by students in school, not just in college, etc., etc. So we have that aspect, new disciplines. Then we have to look at what we already have and modernize it. Why so much trigonometry if we don't need as many woodworkers and land surveyors? And why so little statistic and probability when we need data experts and more of them by the hour? So we have to modernize even the traditional disciplines and make difficult choices there. And lastly, again, in an era that where we can find information, it's not just about basic information, basic knowledge. It's about methods and tools, but even more importantly, it's about concepts and meta-concepts, things that bring all these disciplines together. For instance, the concept of proof in mathematics, all the way to the concept of proof in philosophy. You know, these are the things that we need to understand and how these things link together, because these silos do not allow us to do a transfer, you know, from one discipline to another. So we could be great critical thinkers in one discipline, but being unable to transfer that to another one. And yet that's what education should be about too. It's about transfer.
This idea of some concepts that can cross over the different disciplines, do you think that also opened the door for a sort of transdisciplinary form of organized curriculum?
Absolutely, but that has to be done in balance. So let me take the example, the analogy of playing an instrument. You want to be able to play with an orchestra, of course, but that presupposes also having mastered your instrument. And mastering your instrument doesn't mean only doing scales. It also means practicing pieces. And so you have to have the right blend of, first of all, solo practice. Within that, the right blend of playing the pieces most of the time, but also the scales. And then once you're ready, then you want to play with an orchestra or a band as soon as possible to put it in context. So putting things in context matters a great deal, because that's where we find relevance. And as we know from neuroscience, we pay attention when we find things relevance. Relevance is what motivates. And it's a tricky thing for each one of us, but that's what everyone is begging for. How many times have we been in classrooms asking ourselves, why do I need to know this? And so in a world that's full of information and with scarce understanding, it's normal that students would be asking themselves even more, so why do I need to know this if I can find it somewhere? Mm-hmm. What's the point? So we need to push to a deeper level of understanding. This is what we're asking for. It's about understanding.
You think that they have this criticism about that they have some curriculum overloaded, and we have must go to some more simple curriculums, some in the core of some elements. You agree with this criticism?
I do agree. I do agree in general. But strangely, I would like every discipline to teach more, deeper, in less time. It sounds contradictory, but let me explain. Any curriculum is full of assumptions about what is really useful or not. Some of the usefulness has changed over the centuries, but we still teach it as if it's just as useful. We made adaptations here and there. For instance, generally speaking, you don't learn how to use logarithmic tables anymore. We don't learn how to extract a square root by hand anymore. But why do we don't learn how to speak Greek and Latin anymore? So there has been adaptations, but not enough. Because every discipline considers that it is really the most important discipline. Every discipline expert considers that their branch is the one that should be favored and not the other people's branches. We all have this, it's a very human thing. We all have our biases, you know, our confirmation biases. What we know is what's important. So when you put experts in a room and you ask them to change, it's really hard for normal reasons. You have groupthink, you have confirmation bias, and it's hard to say, you know what, we should be teaching less trigonometry. Even if I'm a geometry expert, I will say, yes, we should be teaching less geometry. That's not going to happen. And of course, we don't even invite the statistics person because, oh, that's not really mathematics, right, in the opinion of people. And yet it's such an important branch nowadays. And we don't do algorithmics and so on and so forth. And so we neglect the new branches. We overemphasize the old branches. Each old branch is full of obsolete line items. And there you go. And of course, then we end up putting things on top. And we complain that they're overloaded. Of course they are. So it's a bit like your home budget. If you're spending too much every month, you go and analyze your expenses and you say, you know what, every line item I can justify in isolation, but altogether they break my bank. So should you be really teaching long division by hand? Should we really be doing polynomials by hand, etc., etc.? In Greek history, for instance, should we be focusing on the context and the battles, or should we be doing more deep dives into how did democracy emerge, how did autocracy emerge, why did they both prosper, why did they both die, what were the different reasons? Deep understanding. Of course you want to do some context, but you have to have the right blend of context versus depth. And so you would want to teach actually more branches of any given discipline, but making the careful choices with a scalpel of what to remove, so there's time to teach different branches, different concepts, different ideas in every discipline, but do so deeper selectively, where we want to place a lot of emphasis. And so these are all about careful choices about what matters in every discipline.
But who can do that? Because if you say this, okay, the academics and the different disciplines will battle for their, who can see all the forest?
Thank you. So this is exactly the same analogy I use. We have a number of people who end up looking at the bark of the tree, not even the whole tree of their discipline. And even if they look at their whole tree of their discipline, they don't look at the other species. They're not benevolent to the other species of the other disciplines. And even when they do that, they're not fully understanding of the whole ecosystem of the forest. So I think in the choice of the people, whether it's in policy making or in the experts that are chosen, we have to choose people who are a bit themselves Renaissance people, who will understand that, you know what, yes, this is how history is used, this is how mathematics is used. Use also users of the discipline, not just experts of the discipline. So if you're going to be rethinking mathematics and physics and so on, why not ask biologists and social scientists and engineers to participate in the conversation full time, not just to give advice, full time, with equal voting rights, so that in the end, when we vote on what actually matters in every discipline, it's not only left to the experts of the discipline, because very often they will only look at the bark of the tree.
You add that, say, one element is the knowledge, other element is the skills.
Yes.
What about the skills? What type of skills do you think that for this new world are important?
Well, these are the same skills that have always been important. It's just that we haven't taught them deliberately, systematically, demonstrably in education systems. And these are things such as creativity, critical thinking, communication, collaboration.
You say the 4 C's.
The 4 C's, exactly. It's basically what takes knowledge and makes it alive. It's how you use your knowledge. And that's absolutely essential, but it has always been essential, except that in the past we used to rely on our life to teach us these things, and we made the assumption that just because we were learning a discipline, we were necessarily learning the skill associated with the discipline. I can tell you from personal experience that I've gone through a lot of art work that was completely repetitive and didn't create an ounce of creativity in me. And so just because you do art doesn't mean you're going to be more creative. Just because you do math doesn't mean you're going to be a good critical thinker. We make these logical leaps, these assumptions, that just because we sometimes understand the knowledge, we're truly going to graduate to the point where we know how to use the knowledge.
And you don't think that some of these skills really have new requirements in the new world? Some of the 4 C's?
Of course they do. I mean, the Greeks used to teach rhetoric and oratory, and then we abandoned that, and now it's called communication and majors, and it's in college. Why? This could be brought back into schools as well. We all need to communicate better. It's a fact of life. We all need to collaborate with each other. And so these things have always been necessary. They just have to be done again, as I said, deliberately, systematically, and demonstrably. That's what we've been missing.
In your scheme also you have the character.
Yes.
This is complementary, and that is all.
Absolutely.
It's all
in character we put a lot of
and all aspect of the education too.
Absolutely. That's what makes us successful in life, is our character. And by character, we mean a number of things. You know, there are 200 different words that people throw together in this bucket of social and emotional, quote-unquote, skills. And these are things such as mindfulness, curiosity, courage, resilience, ethics, and leadership. These are the 6 originating qualities that we have isolated from which you can recompose all of the other 200 words that people talk about. Now, it's critical to have that condensing of it all, this distillation of it all. Because otherwise, if you have to optimize for 25 different parameters, you just can't do that. But you can do that for 4 C's. You can do that for 6 character qualities. It's manageable, it's actionable.
And you also incorporate the idea of meta-learning.
Yes.
What's mean this meta-learning?
Well, in a world that's constantly changing, adaptation is necessary. And adaptation comes from, first, being confident that we can adapt. And that's a growth mindset. That's what Carol Dweck has been talking about at Stanford. And there's also our metacognitive abilities, our ability to step out of ourselves and to look at our actions and thoughts and behaviors, reflect on them, and adapt them. So it's a bit like, constantly having 2 brains functioning in parallel. Mm-hmm. I'm talking to you, and I'm, in a sense, observing myself talking to you and monitoring whether I'm being too strident, too fast, or not enough. This constant monitoring function that we all do. It's just that we want to make this a systematic thing. Mm-hmm. If we put meta-learning under something else, it will get ignored. And yet, in a world that's rapidly changing, that is the one dimension of an education that has to be highlighted and paid attention to.
Excellent. Well, we have this possibility to talk and have this dialogue with Charles Fadel of Harvard and the Center of Redesign of the Curriculum. And well, now we have at the end of the interview our regular traditional question about our educational system. And if you have to give to us, the Chileans, but maybe the Latin Americans too, it's the same, very similar, one advice for change our education, what will be your advice?
It's of course very hard to give advice because the advice is easy, the implementation is the hard part. But let me perhaps try something. First of all, I'm very impressed by the can-do attitude of the country, and this is something to conserve absolutely at all costs. There seems to be this eagerness to progress, this ability, inner ability, a gentle confidence that I see in the country that is really something to treasure. On top of that, you may want to say perhaps the problem comes from end of studies exams. This is what we see around the world. College entrance requirements and the assessments that go with that end up biasing backwards all of schools, what schools teach. Because in essence, everyone is trying to prepare you to get into college. But even the college entrance requirements are obsolete. They're from another era. And they pay attention only to a very narrow set of capabilities, your grades about knowledge, about traditional knowledge. Whereas a broader measure of the full individual is really what should be required. And now, rather than taking the needs of education for life and for work and derating them down to only traditional knowledge that can be measured for higher ed, we should perhaps push the other way and say, we will need to change these assessments and these requirements so that we can reach as far as we can in the aspiration we have and not derate the aspiration down.
Thank you, Charles Fadel. And bueno, los dejamos invitados para que vean también el conjunto de entrevistas educativas que están disponibles en el portal educarchile.cl.